These were members of a group called Andrews Raiders, and they participated in the Great Locomotive Chase of April of 1862. This actually inspired two feature films.
Welcome, Kyle Purchase. A little bit about him. If you didn't read the bio, he studied political science and international relations. He went to Temple. He went to Widener. He got his master's in public policy, and now he works at the Capitol. You may all know him as the familiar face. Every time I'm around, I tend to see Kyle. But what you don't know is that he's not just a familiar face. He's our secretary, and he does Zoom presentations. So he's also a teacher. And I will say his fascination with the Civil War has led him to be a relentless contributor to people just like us. I've lots of gratitude for Kyle. And he's also in the Sons of Union Veterans, as am I, and as some people here today are. He was just, I just learned that he was voted in and sworn in as commander of one of the camps that he belongs to. So I congratulate you on that. And may you do great work with that as well. If there's anything else you'd like to add and tell us about your presentation, go right on ahead.
Oh, well, thank you, Brian. It's very kind of you for those very kind words. And I want to thank all of you for joining us today for my presentation on the Medal of Honor. And when I was preparing for this presentation, you might have seen in the bio or as part of the bio or paragraph or two, over 1,400 individuals throughout the Civil War were awarded the Medal of Honor for their actions. And when you're trying to put a presentation like this together about reading the citations and the stories, I try to want to capture some of the different kinds of actions that were worthy of bestowment at that time. And as Brian had mentioned earlier, I do work at the Capitol building where I help report about committee meetings, voting meetings. We summarize legislation. Well, the Medal of Honor started with legislation. It was a couple of pieces of action from Congress. The first legislation dealt with the establishment of the Navy and Marines version of the Medal of Honor, and that was introduced in December of 1861 by Senator James Wilson Grimes of Iowa. I almost said Ohio, Iowa. And in quotations marks, you can see the quote from the legislation there. Authorizing the production and distribution of medals of honor to be presented to enlisted seamen and Marines who distinguished themselves by gallantry in action and other seaman-like qualities during the American Civil War. And a few months later, February of 1862, Senator Harry Wilson of Massachusetts introduced the Army version for the Medal of Honor. President Lincoln ended up signing both bills into law. The Navy Marines version, December the 21st of 1861, and for the Army later in July of 1862. Army officers became eligible on March the 3rd of 1863, and Navy officers did not become eligible until much later in 1915. Now, what I find it's also important to include here is Executive Order 352-A, September the 20th, 1905. And this was during the, Theodore Roosevelt's administration, whereas you can see in quotations and italicized that it calls for the official presentation of the Medal of Honor to a recipient in the form of a ceremony. Now, and this is the ceremony that you may be thinking about whenever you see a modern presentation today. Members of the local media or the press will be there, CNN, Fox News, C-SPAN, the recipient, members of the recipient's family, the President of the United States, the Secretary of Defense, and so on and so forth. Prior to that, it wasn't necessarily the case. Sometimes medals might have been awarded to someone when they might be in active combat, in active duty. And it actually says towards the end of this quotation, the presentation will be made by the division or higher commander. Oh, it says on campaign, during the campaign. And I believe one of the individuals I'm going to talk about had his Medal of Honor actually mailed to him during the war, because at the time there was no formal ceremony, or at least there wasn't an executive order establishing a formal ceremony. But that changed under the Roosevelt administration. So as of today's presentation, February the 2nd, 2025, I just have some statistics here before we get to the citations. A total of 3,547 medals have been awarded. As far as actions in the Civil War, that is 1,525, which is approximately 43%. As you can see here, it is broken down by the branch. Army is just over 1,200, Navy a little over 317 for the Marine Corps. Out of the total of 3,547, 19 individuals have the distinguished honor of being awarded the Medal of Honor twice, which represents a 0.5% of all recipients. 18.5% of medals of honor were awarded posthumously. 77% of medals were for enlisted personnel, and 23% were for officers. Those, the last three numbers I mentioned, refer to the total number of medals, not just the Civil War. Now, you may be wondering, why were there so many medals awarded for the Civil War? Well, to help explain, other military honors you might hear in the media, such as the Distinguished Service Cross, the Purple Heart, the Silver Star, the Legion of Merit, and the Bronze Star, were not introduced until the years towards the end of World War I and during World War II. So during the time of the Civil War, the only medal that could be bestowed upon a soldier for gallantry in action or combat would be a Medal of Honor, and all those were not established, till much later. And one final note, it's important to note, these individuals are referred to as recipients, not winners. One does not win the Medal of Honor. It's not a competition in the sense of a sporting event, which the Super Bowl is only a week away, or like a science fair project. The Medal of Honor means a lot more to these individuals. And I'm going to mention some literature that I helped to create this presentation. And it does mention Medal of Honor winners. So you might see it in older literature and things like that, but they are referred to as recipients and not winners. So for those of you who might have joined me last year, I believe I spoke in April of 2024 for the museum when I talked about the Grand Army of the Republic and the auxiliary organizations that still exist today. One of them being the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War, which I'm a proud member of. I'm a proud member of two camps. So you may notice here on the far right, that is the membership medal or badge of the Grand Army of the Republic. But you see the other two pictures, the one on the furthest to the left and one in the middle, are the Medals of Honor, the original designs, I should say. The one on the left is the Army's version, which has an eagle with cross cannons directly above the five-pointed star. And the one in the middle is for the Navy and the Marine Corps. And instead of an eagle with cross cannons, you see an anchor. Now, the way to tell the difference between them is you look at the location of where the eagle or cross cannons is as its relationship to the five-pointed star. For the Grand Army of the Republic membership badge, the eagle with cross cannons is above the ribbon and not directly above the five-pointed star. And also, if you look at the figures inside the five-pointed star, in the GAR's badge, you see multiple figures, and that's supposed to represent fraternity, charity, and loyalty, the ideals of the GAR and the Allied orders of today. On the other two, it's two figures. It's Minerva, who is a Greek goddess representing Greek goddess of war and I think wisdom as well, fighting off a figure holding snakes, which is supposed to represent discord. And also you can see the sizes of the ribbons are different as well. And also there is no stars on these ribbons. So these are the current medal designs for our armed services. On the left is the Army, in the middle, which is still almost close to the original design from the past slide, and that's for the Navy, Marine Corps, and Coast Guard. And on the right, that is for the Air Force. And if a member of the Space Force were ever to be awarded the Medal of Honor, that person would be awarded the Air Force design. And you will also notice it is now a neck ribbon, and that was introduced later during the Medal of Honor's history. It was originally pinned on, and I can go back real quick. It was originally pinned on, but now it's now a neck ribbon. So what exactly would be qualifying actions for the medal? Well, as far as the Civil War is concerned, it was the phrase of acts of valor, gallantry, bravery, and self-sacrifice. So I have here in bullet points a couple of examples that you might that a soldier might be awarded for. So, for example, rescuing wounded comrades or the regimental flag. Also, sometimes referred to as the colors, rescuing the colors. Capturing an enemy flag, artillery, soldiers, or an enemy officer, saving the command. Delivering a message while under fire, filling water canteens behind enemy lines. Now, as strange as that may be, if you think about it, one enemy that both armies fought was the weather, especially if you are down in the South and it's in the middle of the summer, you're wearing wool clothing, you're going to get dehydrated very, very quickly, especially when you do not have water. So, there have been at least 2 instances in the history of the Medal of Honor where a soldier was awarded the Medal of Honor for filling water canteens behind enemy lines and then giving it to their comrades. So, in a way, you are saving their life. Retrieving ammunition when regiment is low or runs out. Now, how does someone recommend the medal? So, there could be letters of recommendation written by commanding officers. Sometimes the individuals may report it themselves. Sometimes there may be battle reports detailing what happened at a certain battle, and sometimes the official records of the War of the Rebellion might sometimes mention the action. And the letters of recommendation could have been written by commanding officers of companies, regiments, divisions, and that would be used at the time to verify the action. Nominations would be the qualifying individual, the comrades who might have seen the action, commanding officers, or even members of Congress. So now standards for these have changed as far as the nomination process is concerned. And that's what this slide is. This is one of the more modern procedures within the Department of Defense, or DoD for short. And you can see it actually starts at the top. The service member performs act warranting recommendation, and there's 2 different ways that it can proceed through the chain. So you can have the original nomination for the award, or you can start with a member of Congress. And you tend to see that for posthumous awardees. Usually, sometimes a member of Congress might recommend someone who might have a different medal, let's say the Distinguished Service Cross, but would be, oh, I want to recommend this person for the Medal of Honor. So it would go in that path. And then it would go to either the service secretary to review or the chain of command review. And then it would go to the Decorations Board, the service chief, secretary of the military department, and then you can see on the side there with all of the different committees and subcommittees that the nomination would be requested or reviewed. Goes back to the secretary of the military department, the Secretary of Defense, and the person that has the final say is the President of the United States. And then if the President okays it, and then they would inform the individual that you have been awarded the Medal of Honor, and then they would set up a date for the ceremony when possible. So before we get, so this is, I guess, the first group of citations. We have to first talk about the first recipients. Now, these were members of a group called Andrew's Raiders, and they participated in the Great Locomotive Chase of April of 1862. This actually inspired 2 feature films. One was a silent film calling the Great Locomotive Chase. I'm sorry, the silent film was called The General, which was the name of the train they stole. And the Great Locomotive Chase, I believe, was a Disney film that came out in the 1950s. So what you see here is at Chattanooga National Cemetery, and those are some of the burials of the Andrews Raiders, some of the first recipients of the Medal of Honor. And to the right, I believe that was a photo taken in, I want to say the early 1900s, like between 1905 and 1910. I'm not quite sure. But the first recipients were Privates Jacob Parrott, William Bensinger, Robert Buffum, Sergeant Elihu H. Mason, Corporals William Pittenger, and William H. Reddick. But you might have seen in the news last year or last summer, President Biden posthumously awarded 2 other Raiders, Privates George Wilson and Philip Shadrach. And the overall mission of the Raiders were to steal a train behind Confederate lines and to travel north to sabotage railroads that were supplying Confederate forces. And some of them were caught and were executed as being spies, and some of them were able to survive the war. And for these medals back in March of 1863, Secretary Stanton, who's the Secretary of War, had presented the first 6 medals to these raiders. And in November the 15th, 1990, there's an act designated by Congress as Medal of Honor Day, and that day is March 25th. So, starting with the first 2 here, we have First Sergeant George Washington Roosevelt of the 26th Pennsylvania Infantry and musician Richard Enderlin of the 73rd Ohio Infantry, Company B. So, for George Washington Roosevelt, his actions were for the Battle of Second Bull Run, or Manassas, whatever you prefer, and also Gettysburg. So for him, he technically could be awarded, have been awarded 2 Medals of Honor, but for this citation, they were combined as 1. So for his, it reads, at Bull Run, Virginia, recaptured the colors which had been seized by the enemy. At Gettysburg, captured a Confederate color bearer and colors, in which effort he was severely wounded. Now, what's interesting with Mr. Roosevelt, and you can see in this picture, he is wearing his Medal of Honor in front of his chest, and if towards the further right of the picture, you can see him wearing his Grand Army of the Republic medal. And you can tell because if you look close enough, you can see where the eagles and cross cannons are. Now, interestingly about his medal. So interestingly enough, with this medal, I don't know, as I was saying, I don't know how, but it got stolen. And this gentleman, this was probably, I want to say early 2000s, but I could be wrong. Anyway, so this gentleman stole it. How he got it, I don't know. I've never stolen one, and I don't recommend it. So he decided to go on eBay and try to make a quick buck by selling a Medal of Honor. And in case you may not know, it is illegal to sell a Medal of Honor. Well, there was a purchaser who was interested, and apparently they set a date to meet up. And turns out the purchaser was an undercover agent for the FBI, and the gentleman was arrested. So the good news is with this with Roosevelt's medal, his medal was recovered, and another medal that was stolen had also been recovered and are now on display in another museum, safe and secure. So moving on to Enderlin here, also for actions at Gettysburg. Enderlin voluntarily took a rifle and served as a soldier in the ranks during the first and second days of the battle. Voluntarily and at his own imminent peril, went into the enemy's lines at night and, under a sharp fire, rescued a wounded comrade. Now, unfortunately for the wounded comrade, he would not survive his injuries. I believe he was shot in the hip. And in fact, if you go to Gettysburg, you can actually visit the site where the soldier was wounded. It's around 730 Fairview Avenue, which is it's a private residence, so you don't want to so you want to respect the individual's property. But very close to the sidewalk, there's a little marker that says where the soldier was wounded. Now, the wounded comrade was a private by the name of George Nixon, and he is buried in the soldiers' Ohio section in the National Soldier Cemetery at Gettysburg. And if you're wondering with that last name, Nixon, well, you'd be right to have a suspicion because George Nixon is Richard Nixon's great grandfather. And this is a photograph of him at the cemetery in the 1950s when he was then vice president under President Eisenhower. And in the middle, I believe that is Pat Nixon. And on the left, I don't quite know who that is. Perhaps maybe one of the caretakers of the museum, not the museum, the cemetery at that time. But yes, you can see George Nixon's grave there in Gettysburg. The next two, we have Corporal John Freeman Mackey, United States Marine Corps. And we have Colonel St. Clair Augustine Mulholland of the 116th Pennsylvania. So with Mackey, who was also the first Marine to be awarded the Medal of Honor, for his actions were at Drury's Bluff. On board the USS Galena in the attack on Fort Darling at Drury's Bluff, James River on the 15th of May, 1862. As enemy shellfire raked the deck of his ship, Corporal Mackey fearlessly maintained his musket fire against the rifle pits along the shore and, when ordered to fill vacancies at guns caused by men wounded and killed in action, manned the weapon with skill and courage. For St. Clair Augustine Mulholland for actions at the Battle of Chancellorsville. In command of the picket line, held the enemy in check all night to cover the retreat of the army. And after the war, Mulholland would serve as Philadelphia chief of police and would also be a U.S. pension agent. And of course, I have here the 116th Pennsylvania was one of the famous Irish Brigade regiments, along with the 63rd, 69th, 88th New York, and 28th Massachusetts. And this is just on the left is an artist's rendition of Mackey's action at Drury's Bluff. And on the right is an actual photograph of the USS Galena. And it's kind of hard to see, but at the very, very bottom of the photograph, you can see battle damage that the ship took during the battle. All right, the next two. Color Sergeant William H. Carney, 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry, and Sergeant Thomas Plunkett, 21st Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry Company E. Now, with William Carney, his actions were for the Battle of Fort Wagner. His citation reads, when the color sergeant was shot down, this soldier grasped the flag, led the way to the parapet, and planted the colors thereon. When the troops fell back, he brought off the flag under a fierce fire in which he was twice severely wounded. Now, if you are familiar with the movie Glory, which came out in 1989, that movie depicts the 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry. And if you, and Carney is not in the movie, but if you take the characters played by Morgan Freeman and Denzel Washington, you put them together, that is supposed to represent Sergeant Carney. Thomas Plunkett for actions at the Battle of Fredericksburg. Plunkett citation. Sees the colors of his regiment, the color bearer having been shot down, and bore them to the front, where both his arms were carried off by a shell. And you can see in that photograph of Mr. Plunkett, both of his sleeves have no arms, and the flag that he held is currently in the Massachusetts State House. And I believe I don't have a picture on this presentation, but you can clearly see where his blood was on the flag. It left a significant stain on the flag because of the blood he was losing. Colonel John Frederick Hartranft, 51st Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry, actions at the Battle of First Bull Run, or Manassas. Voluntarily served as an aide and participated in the battle after expiration of his term of service, distinguishing himself in rallying several regiments which had been thrown into confusion. Now, Hartranft would eventually go on to have a very lengthy career, particularly here in Harrisburg. He would serve as Auditor General and eventually Governor of Pennsylvania. And he was also at one point Commander-in-Chief of the Grand Army of the Republic, serving that role from 1875 to 1877. Jefferson Coates, Sergeant of the 7th Wisconsin Infantry Company H, for actions at Gettysburg. For extraordinary heroism on July the 1st, 1863, while serving with Company H, 7th Wisconsin Infantry, in action at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, for unsurpassed courage in battle where he had both eyes shot out. Now, there is actually, it was on McPherson's Ridge with the Iron Brigade, which that regiment was with. He was also bayoneted in his side, and he was eventually treated at Satterley Hospital in Philadelphia. And he eventually learned to read Braille. And there is actually a campus for the Missouri School for the Blind that is named after him. Gottlieb Luddy, or Luddy, Corporal, 74th New York Infantry, Company A, and Robert Penn, 1st Sergeant, United States Color Troops of Company I. So for Luddy, actions were for Chancellorsville in 1863. His citation was, he bravely advanced to the enemy's line under heavy fire and brought back valuable information. Now, you might be wondering, what is that valuable information? Well, the valuable information was that he, along with 3 others, discovered Stonewall Jackson's position in his accidental shooting. And this was after the 11th Corps had been attacked by Stonewall Jackson's men. So General Hiram Berry ordered a recon mission at that time of day. And it was one of the last things he said before he was killed, to have these men be given a special award. and those awards would be the Medal of Honor. So him and 3 others who went with him were all awarded the Medal of Honor. Robert Penn, for the Battle of Chaffin's Farm, took command of his company after all the officers had been killed or wounded and gallantly led in the battle. And after the war, was serving the Grand Army of the Republic, and at one point would be a junior vice commander for the Department of Ohio. And there's actually a ROTC shooting range named after him at the University of Akron. Henry Harrison Bingham, Captain, 148th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry, Company G, and Colonel Charles H.T. Collis of the 114th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry, a Zouave regiment. For Bingham, for actions at the Battle of the Wilderness, rallied and led into action a portion of the troops who had given way under the fierce assaults of the enemy. And for Bingham, he would serve 32 years in the U.S. House of Representatives. And there was the scene, if you are familiar with the movie Gettysburg, towards the end of the movie, you see Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain's brother Thomas attend to the wounded Louis Armistead. Now, in reality, it was Bingham who attended Armistead and not Chamberlain's brother. And you'll see in the monument, a friend to a friend monument, the Masonic monument at Gettysburg depicts this scene, which you'll see in a later slide. As for Collis, his actions were for Fredericksburg. And Collis gallantly led his regiment in battle at a critical moment. And this scene was actually depicted in a famous painting by Karl Röchling, specifically the Slaughter Pen. So that is the monument that I referred to earlier. That is a Brotherhood Undivided memorial in the Soldier Cemetery Annex in Gettysburg, with Bingham attending to the wounded Louis Armistead. And this is the famous painting Karl Röchling did depicting Collis's actions at Fredericksburg. And Collis is the one carrying the colors, and he's also on his horse. Now, probably an individual you have heard many, many times throughout Civil War history and books and documentaries and movies and TV, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, Colonel of the 20th Maine, for actions at Gettysburg. Daring heroism and great tenacity in holding his position on the Little Round Top against repeated assaults and carrying the advanced position on the Great Round Top. Corporal Francis A. Waller, 6th Wisconsin Infantry, Company I, another one of the Iron Brigade regiments. And for his capture, or for his actions, again, was at Gettysburg, and his citation was capture of the flag of the 2nd Mississippi Infantry at Gettysburg. Now, you might have seen the movie Gettysburg that depicts Chamberlain's actions, but Waller's was actually depicted in a portrait or a print by Don Troiani, who is a well-known artist of Civil War and I think Revolutionary War prints. And that is the one of Waller, which you might have seen on it either in Civil War magazines, again, documentaries, or books. And sometimes you will see this depicted. And now, this is the youngest to ever receive the Medal of Honor, Willie Johnston, a musician of the 3rd Vermont Infantry of Company D. Now, I try to research what battle this was for, and according to one newspaper called the Caledonian, it only said 7 days fight before Richmond, so it was quite broad in that regard, as is the citation. All it says is gallantry in 7-day battle and Peninsula Campaign. But as you can see in this photograph, right between where the straps is, he's holding the drum, is the Medal of Honor pinned to him. And now, Dr. Mary Edwards Walker, surgeon of the 52nd Ohio Infantry. She is to date the only woman to be awarded the Medal of Honor. Now, the citation is pretty lengthy, and you'll see why. Because it kind of explains this was actually not for a specific battle compared to the other ones I've already read through. But bear with me for this one. It says, whereas it appears from official reports that Dr. Mary E. Walker, a graduate of medicine, has rendered valuable service to the government, and her efforts have been earnest and untiring in a variety of ways. In that she was assigned to duty and served as an assistant surgeon in charge of female prisoners at Louisville, Kentucky, upon the recommendation of Major Generals Sherman and Thomas, and faithfully served as contract surgeon in the service of the United States, and has devoted herself with a much patriotic zeal to the sick and wounded soldiers, both in the field and hospitals, to the detriment of her own health, and has also endured hardships as a prisoner of war for 4 months in a southern prison while acting as contract surgeon. And whereas, by reason of her not being a commissioned officer in the military service, a brevet or honorary rank cannot, under existing laws, be conferred upon her. And whereas, in the opinion of the President, an honorable recognition of her services and sufferings should be made, it is ordered that a testimonial thereof shall be hereby made and given to the said Dr. Mary E. Walker, and that the usual Medal of Honor for meritorious services be given her, given under my hand in this city of Washington, D.C., on the 11th day of November, 1865, Andrew Johnson. Now, interestingly enough, in the citation I read, it kind of tells you already that even though this would not necessarily be, I guess, worthy of bestowment of the Medal of Honor at that time, President Johnson even admits it in this citation, which I find quite interesting. And we're going to hear about Dr. Walker a little bit later on, and you'll see why when it came to reviewing Medals of Honor. And as another interesting fact, the museum has her surgery kit on display in the women's section of the museum. Now, sometimes, I did mention earlier in the talk that Medals of Honor are sometimes awarded posthumously. These are 2 examples where they have been posthumously awarded. The one on the left we'll talk about first is Andrew Jackson Smith, who was a color sergeant of the 55th Massachusetts Infantry. His citation reads, this is for the Battle of Honey Hill, Corporal Andrew Jackson Smith of Clinton, Illinois, a member of the 55th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry, distinguished himself on the 30th of November, 1864, by saving his regimental colors after color bearer was killed during a bloody charge at the Battle of Honey Hill, South Carolina. In the late afternoon, as the 55th Regiment pursued enemy skirmishers and conducted a running fight, they ran into a swampy area backed by a rise where the Confederate Army awaited. The surrounding woods and thick underbrush impeded infantry movement and artillery support. The 55th and 54th Regiments formed columns to advance to the enemy position in a flanking movement. As the Confederates repelled other units, the 55th and 54th Regiments continued to move into flanking positions. Forced into a narrow gorge crossing a swamp in the face of the enemy positions, the 55th Color Sergeant was killed by an exploding shell, and Corporal Smith took the regimental colors from his hand and carried them through heavy grape and canister fire. Although half of the officers and a third of the enlisted men engaged in the fight were killed or wounded, Corporal Smith continued to expose himself to the enemy fire by carrying the colors throughout the battle. Through his actions, the regimental colors of the 55th Infantry Regiment were not lost to the enemy. Corporal Andrew Jackson Smith's extraordinary valor in the face of deadly enemy fire is in keeping with the highest traditions of military service and reflect great credit upon him, the 55th Regiment, and the United States Army. Sergeant Smith would be awarded posthumously in 2001 by President Bill Clinton, and he was able to give it to descendants of Smith. As a matter of fact, his grandson wrote a book about his story, and he even has dressed up as him to tell his story throughout the country and living history events. Now, other than the recent posthumous awardees of 2 of the Andrews Raiders I talked about earlier, another posthumous awardee is First Lieutenant Alonzo Cushing of the 4th United States Artillery Battery A for his action at Gettysburg. His citation reads, First Lieutenant Alonzo H. Cushing distinguished himself by acts of bravery above and beyond the call of duty while serving as an artillery commander in Battery A, 4th U.S. Artillery, Army of the Potomac at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania on July 3, 1863, during the American Civil War. That morning, Confederate forces led by General Robert E. Lee began cannonading First Lieutenant Cushing's position on Cemetery Ridge. Using field glasses, or what we may refer to as goggles, First Lieutenant Cushing directed fire for his own artillery battery. He refused to leave the battlefield after being struck in the shoulder by a shell fragment. As he continued to direct fire, he was struck again, this time suffering grievous damage to his abdomen. Still refusing to abandon his command, he boldly stood tall in the face of Major General George E. Pickett's charge and continued to direct devastating fire into oncoming forces. As the Confederate forces closed in, First Lieutenant Cushing was struck in the mouth by an enemy bullet and fell dead beside his gun. His gallant stand and fearless leadership inflicted severe casualties upon Confederate forces and opened wide gaps in their lines, directly impacting the Union's forces' ability to repel Pickett's charge. First Lieutenant Cushing's extraordinary heroism and selflessness above and beyond the call of duty at the cost of his own life are in keeping with the highest traditions of military service and reflect great credit upon himself, Battery A, 4th U.S. Artillery, Army of the Potomac, and the United States Army. Cushing was awarded his medal in 2014 under President Obama, and he gave the medal to a descendant of Cushing, and who was acting at the time was a constituent living in Minnesota, and actually was living on Cushing's father's property. And she really initiated the research and the nomination process to her local representative. I think it was a congressman at the time. So, as you can see here on the left, that is the posthumous awardee for Andrew Jackson Smith to descendants of Smith, and to the right, that is President Obama giving to a descendant of Cushing. I believe that is his second cousin, a couple of generations removed. So it was a very touching moment for both families. And so I had mentioned earlier in the presentation about double recipients of the Medal of Honor. I'm going to touch upon these gentlemen here, in which at least one of their medals was for actions in the Civil War. So starting with Thomas Custer, who was the brother of George Armstrong Custer. Both were for actions in the Civil War and were days apart. And both actions involved chasing the enemy by riding his horse and jumping over a fence and charging directly at the enemy. Unfortunately for Custer, he would be killed at the Battle of Little Bighorn along with his brother, George. John Lafferty, or Lafferty, has different spellings. He is buried in the Navy plot at Mount Moriah Cemetery in the Yaden side of Mount Moriah. So the first medal was for transferring 2 torpedoes across an island swamp and keeping guard of them. And 24 hours in the rain and in the swampy conditions, and was the plan to destroy the Albemarle. The second was a similar one to John Cooper's, where he saved a man from a fire at a Mobile and risking being blown up in the process. And as for John Cooper, his first was for the Battle of Mobile Bay, similar to John Mackey's, if you remember, and also for the capture of the CSS Tennessee. And Cooper's second medal was similar to Lafferty's second medal. Down to the left is Frank Baldwin. His first medal was for Peachtree Creek, in which he helped capture 2 officers, Confederate officers. And his second medal was during the Indian Wars or Indian campaigns, where he rescued 2 girls from Indian capture, and that was the part of the German family massacre. Now, German is referring to the last name of the family, not the ethnicity or the language that they spoke. And the last one is Patrick Mullen. His first medal was for assisting an officer by loading a howitzer while laying prone or lying on your back. And the second was rescuing an officer from drowning, both for Maddox Creek. And now, when you're preparing a presentation with a lot of stories and trying to pick the ones that you try to capture different battles and different actions, you kind of come across interesting parallels to history. And what I mean by this is that this gentleman on the left, this is a first lieutenant, eventually became an adjutant, and he served in the 24th Wisconsin Infantry. His citation reads, "Seized the colors of his regiment at a critical moment and planted them on the captured works on the crest of Missionary Ridge." Now, not to confuse Missionary Ridge and Gettysburg, this is Missionary Ridge, part of the Chattanooga campaign out west. Now, this gentleman is part of Medal of Honor history because he and his son, which you'll see on the right, make of one of only 2 instances where a father and a son are awarded the Medal of Honor. So without further ado, this is the father, and here is the son. I am sure you can recognize the gentleman on the right. That is General Douglas MacArthur, awarded the Medal of Honor for actions in World War II. And on the left is his father, Arthur MacArthur Jr. The other instance where a father and son duo were awarded the medal were Theodore Roosevelt Sr. and Jr., the senior being the President of the United States. Now it gets a little bit interesting when it comes to all the medals that had been awarded. And in 1916, the federal government decided to have a review board. And it was consisted of 5 members, all retired generals, led by Lieutenant General Nelson A. Miles, who was a recipient himself for his actions at Chancellorsville, where he was severely wounded. And now, at the time, they were asked to review all the medals that were ever issued at that time, and whether or not they met the appropriate requirements to be worthy of the Medal of Honor. Now, the text you see highlighted are quotations of what their instructions were, as you can see there. And to avoid any sort of bias, whether if a name was mentioned in the citation itself, the name was removed and was replaced with a number. And if it was found, the board was provided with supporting documentation for each Medal of Honor. Again, going back to if there was a letter recommending the Medal of Honor, or if there was a diary entry or a battle report, something that could support the medal for the action, the individual for the action, right? And the board at the time also did not want to, quote, second guess the decisions of those previously in command simply because the standards had changed. Let's say there's going to be someone going to be awarded the Medal of Honor in today's Army, Navy, Marine Corps, so on and so forth. Would someone be awarded for filling up a canteen of water? Probably not. But at that time, it was worthy of it. But again, you can see another text or quotation also highlighted to measure the act by the standard established by the authorities at the time rather than by now observed in avoiding retroactive judgment. And so in February 1917, the board had completed their report, and it was determined that 911 medals were deemed suspicious and were rescinded. And one of those was Dr. Walker, but I'll talk about her in a little bit. So the biggest chunk of that 911 was the 27th Maine Volunteer Infantry. Now you're probably wondering, what in the world did this regiment do that the entire regiment would be awarded the Medal of Honor? Well, the term of service for this regiment was expiring in June of 1863. And if you think about it, June of 1863, Washington, D.C., there is the threat of the Confederacy coming up from Maryland into Pennsylvania. This is part of the Gettysburg campaign. So the Army had sent letters to the 27th Maine and another regiment, the 25th Maine, asking to stay in service past their terms. And in return, you will get a Medal of Honor. Well, unfortunately, there was poor record keeping and clerical errors could not determine who decided to stay and actually went home. And the board, when they were reviewing all the paperwork and if the dates were available, determined that the basis for all of those medals were suspicious, and so decided to revoke all of them. The second biggest chunk were the 26 medals awarded to members of Lincoln's Funeral Honor Guard. While that served, because this was deemed to serve as a ceremonial protection and not necessarily engaging with an enemy, engaging in combat. And don't get me wrong, it is honorable to be part of an honor guard, but it was deemed as not meeting the standard of the Medal of Honor. Now, 6 have been restored, part of that group, the 911, and they're listed here. 5 of them were restored in 1989, either during the end of Ronald Reagan's presidency or into the beginning of George H.W. Bush's presidency. Amos Chapman, Buffalo Bill Cody, who was a guy during the Indian Wars, William Dixon, James Dozier, and William Woodall. But in 1977, Dr. Walker's medal was restored in 1977 under the Carter administration. And specifically, I think it was the Secretary of the Army under Carter who restored that. So, and these are just some examples of Medal of Honor headstones you might find at a cemetery. On the left, that's the typical one that would be is like a marble stone that is standing upright, and that is of Frank Furness, who was the captain of Company F of the 6th Pennsylvania Cavalry, also known as Russia's Lancers, because they used to use lances in their early part of their service. And Frank Furness became a well-known architect in Philadelphia, and some of his projects are still up around Philadelphia. And on the right is it's like a more modern looking one, is a flat bronze marker, and that is at Fredericksburg National Cemetery for Lieutenant Colonel Edward Hill of the 16th Michigan. And I'm going to end the presentation with this. So if any of you happen to be in the Arlington, Texas area, well, on March 25th, which again is National Medal of Honor Day, the brand new National Medal of Honor Museum will be opening. And it is believed that current living recipients of the Medal of Honor will be in attendance of the opening. And on the next slide here, it's hard to see, but the National Medal of Honor Museum do have a website, and you can look up all the citations from all wars and conflicts of all kinds of individuals. And everyone has a story, and that's the point I'm trying to make here. And you can also look at the Congressional Medal of Honor Society. That's a good website. And two of the books that some of the books that I use for this presentation, if you can still see it. The first one, this is actually a more modern book. It's called Civil War Medal of Honor Recipients, A Complete Illustrated Record. The only one that I noticed that's not in here is Cushing's medal. But this was published in 2007. But you can find this on Amazon. You can find this probably at the Park Service. I actually got this when I was visiting Antietam in the bookstore there. So a more modern book. But the other one, again, this is an example of a text that says Congressional Medal of Honor and mentions winners inside the book. And this is called Deeds of Valor, which was a reprint from 1992 of an original book that was printed in 1901 or 1902. And it was originally 2 volumes, but this is a 1-volume version of the 1901 book. And we also have a book at the museum, which I don't have a copy of it, but the museum has a book that was published in the 1880s, and that also talks about recipients of the Medal of Honor. So definitely a lot of sources that you can use and read for yourself of the different recipients and the different stories that came out of the Civil War. And there's tons of it, because if I were to read every single citation, it would take me hours to read them. But nevertheless, I appreciate you all taking your time of listening to these stories, and I'd be happy to answer any questions if I can. So thank you all so much.
Kyle, that was fantastic. If anybody has, I have a few questions here. I can kick it off. First, I want to make a comment. I'm glad you talked about some of the depictions on the statues, going to Gettysburg every year that I do. And I look at some of these statues. It's the story behind them themselves are, you take it for granted. And the artwork as well, all this artwork that we've been looking at over these years. It's kind of a deep dive, which I thought was kind of cool.
Sure.
Gottlieb Luddy?
Yeah, Luddy or Ludi. I don't quite know how you pronounce that last name.
Okay. Well, can you clarify what that event was? I tried to follow it, and I didn't quite follow it. What was that event with the reconnaissance with Stonewall Jackson?
So this was after the 11th Corps had been, after the surprise attack by Jackson's men on the 11th Corps at Chancellorsville, and they were tasked with the reconnaissance mission to kind of like go past our lines and to go into their lines without being seen, just to scout and find out where they are. They just, because they didn't know where they were. And then when they were in the process of gathering that information, they had heard Jackson accidentally was shot. And so that part of information, okay, so 1, we know where Jackson's men are, and 2, we now know that Jackson has been shot. And so when they went to go back to tell their commanding officer, General Berry was dead because he was killed. And if you remember, this was around nighttime. So it was like a nighttime mission, really. So because they try to get as close to the enemy without being heard or seen. and then go back to their lines and tell them what they've heard.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting. It wouldn't be too far to stretch your imagination that probing could have caused him to get shot.
Yeah.
If the word that someone was out there and they got a little gun happy. I don't know. It was just, I don't know. That's it. That's an interesting story. Thank you
Yeah.
for clarifying.
Yeah.
Now I heard some stories today that you were telling me about. Let me let Ed in real quick. About saving the colors. I heard that some people got the Medal of Honor for taking colors. Is that true, or did I get that all mixed up in my head and you clarified it?
No, I think you've heard right. There's one where you're saving the colors, you're saving it from being captured by the Confederates. But there's also instances where a Union soldier might have captured Confederate flags. And that happened a lot at Gettysburg. There was a lot of, I think for Gettysburg, there's over 60 some medals that were awarded, and a lot of them were for capturing the flag. But in
Okay.
another story, which I didn't mention it in this presentation, but Hiram Purcell, who was in the 104th Pennsylvania, rescued his regimental colors because they were lying against the fence when they were fighting. And so to avoid them being captured by Confederates, he went and got them. So that's saving the colors.
Okay, and that tells me a little bit about New Jersey's SUV camp, the Purcell camp. Now I
Yep.
know why they named it
Yep.
after him. Like, okay, there we go.
Yep.
Um, now I have the charter member of one of my camps, Tom Cochran. He just donated to the state of Rhode Island the God-on flag that he purchased from a pawn shop in Philadelphia when he was a little boy, his lawnmower money. And he told me a story. He said, when I was in that antique shop, I either was going to buy this flag, which thank God he did because they married it with its sister flag in Rhode Island. It was a nice ceremony. But he said he could buy 2 Medal of Honors. So at that time in the 50s, was that antique shop doing something illegal? I didn't catch when you said that changed.
Yeah, I mean, as far as I know, I believe it is illegal to sell a Medal of Honor, but I don't know because
When they
when I
started
heard
that?
that, yeah, because when I heard that story, I want to say that might have been early 2000 when this guy tried to make a quick buck. But usually, if a museum had, let's say, if a museum has a Medal of Honor, it's usually because of a donation, not because they bought it. It's usually because of a donation, or unless if the descendant of the person had it saying, "I want to donate this to a museum." But I'm not entirely sure about that particular, antique shop that has a Medal of Honor, or at the same time, you want to make sure, was it a Medal of Honor? Because I kind of explain, the difference between, because they look very similar, and if you don't know the difference, they can be very confusing. So, you know, so it could have been a GAR badge, which I've seen being sold on eBay all the time, but I haven't seen a Medal of Honor for sale on eBay, other than the one time where the guy got arrested. But no, so I'm not entirely sure.
Tom would have known the difference, but
Okay.
unless he's remembering back as a boy. I was just curious when they made that illegal.
Yeah.
Now, when did they start? When did they bring in you said World War I, World War II,
Hmm.
the different medals like the Bronze Star, Silver Star, Navy Cross, that kind of stuff?
Yeah.
Was that before or around 1916?
When they started bringing in the other metals.
Yeah. You had a slide on it. And the reason why I ask is you had all those rescinded medals, and 6 of them were restored. But I wonder if that's when they did a replacement for some of those heroic actions. I was just curious if you knew about that.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Not that
Yeah.
I know of at the top of my head.
Okay.
But sometimes I think in the modern, I guess in the modern era now, you might see a story that's the opposite. Let's say someone already has something. Let's say someone has a Distinguished Service Cross, but someone recommends that this should be a Medal of Honor. And I've seen that happen, but I haven't seen or read a situation that you may be talking about.
Okay. I
More
wonder
like,
if you would turn
like
it.
an upgrade, if you will.
Yeah. I wonder if you turn that in if you got a Bronze Star and they.
I don't know, but from what I know, speaking of which, because the Medals of Honor, the designs updated throughout the years, and if someone was awarded the medal, like had the original design, and let's say this soldier wanted the new design of the medal, you had to turn the old one in. So you turn the old one in, you get the new one.
I got a couple of comments. Yeah,
Hey, Tom.
Alonzo Cushing's brother, I believe, may have gotten the Medal of Honor because he was a Navy officer and he led the small boat attack that blew a mine up on the Albemarle in North Carolina, the Confederate ram. They snuck up on the boat in the middle of the night and put a mine on it and blew it up. And I know we were looking up stuff in the museum the other day, and the enlisted men on the boat got the Medal of Honor. So I'm assuming that Cushing's brother Robert probably got the Medal of Honor too. It's a big deal.
Oh, it certainly is. Because I'm looking at one of the books that I have and see if his name is listed. Let's see. I'm not seeing his name, but I could. It's definitely certain. It's definitely worth a follow
And
up.
one of the enlisted men who was with him got a Medal of Honor because we looked it up. I forget Mary Weibel and Walt Lath, looked it up, and yeah, one of the guys had gotten a Medal of Honor. One of the enlisted men. The other thing that one of the reasons that they said the Stonewall Jackson got shot was that during the night, during the engagement, somebody had ordered the 8th Pennsylvania Cavalry to make a move. And when they made the move, and this is while the attack's going on, they ran into the Confederate line and it basically started a firefight. And the guy who commanded the 8th Pennsylvania was Peacock Huey. And he's actually buried up in a cemetery in a church up on at Bustleton and Welsh Road, which is kind of weird. But why they gave a lot of medals? They seem to have given a lot of medals out, like not posthumously, but late awards in like the 1890s. Does that make any sense?
Yeah. This book actually in the back, pulls in the back, and actually one of the questions is what are the books, and I can mention them again, but in the back of the book, they actually do list the years these medals were awarded, and a lot of them were awarded in the 1880s and 1890s, and that was all part of the, I guess, commemorization period, is I think some scholars call it. But and let me just bring it up and they even break it down by when the recipients were born, like their year of birth, the country where they were born. It's pretty interesting. So here's an example: years of issuance. So here's some examples. So they break it down by year, just to give you an example, and they'll have the names listed there.
Because I know one guy who was awarded a Medal of Honor in the 1890s was John Bourke, who was a cavalry. He was in the 15th Pennsylvania Cavalry, and the 15th Pennsylvania had some problems because there was actually a mutiny before the Battle of Stones River, because the regiment was supposed to be raised as a headquarters outfit for the armies of the Cumberland, but when they got to Nashville and the army, they were being thrown in as regular cavalry. So some of the guys refused to take part in the battle. But Bourke and there's a couple other guys who did take part in the battle, and they were, I don't know if that's why exactly they were awarded the Medal of Honor, but it could have been. Bourke went on to have like a 30-year career in the Army. He ended up went to West Point and ended up being a captain, and was one of the guys who wrote some really great books on the Army campaigns in the West. So.
Okay. Yeah, it says here Bourke was awarded his medal November 16th, 1887. Yeah. And the books, by the way, I'll say them again. This one is called Civil War Medal of Honor Recipients, a complete illustrated record by Robert P. Broadwater. It was published in 2007. And the other one I have here is called Deeds of Valor, How America's Civil War Heroes Won the Congressional Medal of Honor. Now, again, this is an older text, so it has win instead of award or recipient. And that's the other thing I didn't quite mention. It's just Medal of Honor. It's not Congressional Medal of Honor. Now, Congressional Medal of Honor sounds more efficient, but it's really just Medal of Honor. Congress created the Medal of Honor, and there's a Congressional Medal of Honor Society. And the reason why it's called that is because it's associated with with Congress, not necessarily the military. Because once the Medal of Honor was in the hands of the military, it's strictly a military award. They don't call it the Congressional Medal of Honor. It's just Medal of Honor. But again, you might see on headstones Congressional Medal of Honor or in an older book like this. But anyways, this was again Deeds of Valor, How America's Civil War Heroes Won the Congressional Medal of Honor. This is a reprint from 1992. And the original was a 2-volume series, and that was published early 1900s, 1901, 1903. And the third book that I had mentioned, I don't remember the title of it, but the museum has a copy of it, and I don't have a copy. It was only these two that I had.
We have a question here from Vicky. Was Clara Barton ever considered for the Medal of Honor? And what about other female doctors or nurses?
As far as my knowledge, no. I don't think I've read any reports that would recommend her for the Medal of Honor. But I guess given with the recent awardees of the two Raiders, I guess never say never. But short answer, no. I have not heard anything of her being considered for the medal. Not to take anything from what she's done, but no.
Right. Yeah. And David kind of touched on that in a comment. He said, I believe there's a medal for civilians that's equivalent to the Medal of Honor. During the evaluation, why wasn't the Doctor's Medal of Honor moved to that?
Yeah, I don't think I'm too familiar with that. I mean, there is the Congressional Gold Medal, and I know some civilians might be awarded that. And there's all kinds of awards that the federal government can issue, even like in modern times now. But I don't know. I'm not familiar with that one from that time.
Okay, Bill has a statement here. He wanted to put it in the chat, and I'll just read it so it's on the record here.
Go ahead.
The selling of the Medal of Honor was made illegal in 1923 when Congress was passed legislation prohibiting the unauthorized manufacture, sale, or wearing of military decoration medals. Law was further strengthened in 2006 with the Stolen Valor Act. Yes. Specifically, according to, he's getting in the weeds here, United States Code, it is illegal to buy, sell, barter, trade, or manufacture any military decoration medal. So even if I'm reading this correctly, even if it's yours to barter, you shouldn't be bartered at. Decoration or medal authorized by Congress, with the Medal of Honor having special protection. The offense carries federal criminal penalties, including fines and imprisonment. Thanks for that, Bill. Appreciate that.
I have two questions, actually. I saw one of the names.
Considering the Civil War, it was all they had. This is just a thought, Kyle. You tell me what you think. The thought they had was we needed to sort of make a hierarchy, and they split it up. And so, 1,500 some odd of the medals were in the Civil War, and then 1,500 cents?
It was 1,525, which is about 43%. So a little under half of all medals was for the Civil War. And
Native American participation would have been after the Civil War. I mean, we did have some regiments on both sides for sure.
The fact that I appreciate you all taking your time out of your Sunday to join us again for a Zoom.